Good evening. I'm Joe McGuire for Connecticut Politics Live. Now, the other night, I did a great interview with Barth Keck, who we've had on the show a couple of times. Barth is in his 32nd year as an English teacher at Haddam Killingworth High School. He's also in his 18th year as a football assistant football coach there. The reason I twofold on Barth. A, he's an excellent op-ed writer, writes for Connecticut News Junkie. He also teaches courses in journalism, media literacy, AP English language and composition. Barth Keck, we just talked not that long ago. Welcome back to Connecticut Politics TV.
Thank you, Joe. Pleasure to be here.
The episode you and I did blew up. It's actually done really well. And in the last couple of days, just in talking to people, the idea of media literacy is very interesting to people. So I'm excited to extend this conversation. And tonight we are going to be joined by Ben Boyington, who wrote The Media and Me, a guide to critical media literacy for young people. Ben is an educator and an education activist based in New Hampshire. He teaches media, English, film, and history at the high school and at the college levels. Outside of the classroom, he's the vice president of the Action Coalition for Media Education and coordinator of Connected Global Critical Media Literacy Project. Very excited to have Ben Boyington join us on Connecticut Politics TV. Ben, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me on, Joe.
All right. So why don't we, since you guys know what you're talking about and you know what you're doing, why don't we start on a basic level? Explain what media literacy is and why everybody in America, especially the youngins, really need this education. Barth, we'll start with you.
Media literacy. Well, it's all in the name, right? Literacy is, in general, literacy is the ability to read and write. Media literacy is the ability to understand the communication that comes through the variety of media. It's essentially being able to decode, understand, and communicate, quite frankly, via media. I could get a little bit more complicated than that, but I want to let Ben. I think Ben. I was reading over some of Ben's information, and I think he's got a real good beat on this.
Well, thank you. I think we talk about media literacy as the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, and create media, which ties directly to what Barth is saying. We like to, with the Media Freedom Foundation and the Project Censored group, with the Media Freedom, the Media Revolution Collective, who actually wrote I want to clarify one thing. I'm one of 10 authors on this book. So it was a pretty big project involving a lot of people, and we all brought something very, very different and put our own stamps on it. So the Media Revolution Collective and Project Censored, we like to talk about critical media literacy, which adds an overlay of understanding the power dynamics behind the creation of media. And I mean, anybody who's doing this is going to talk about messages and how they work and how they operate on people, and ask students to, explore those messages and think about it. And when we push for that critical angle, it's to look a little deeper at who owns the media, who's deciding the messages, who's controlling the messages, whose stories are being told, whose stories are not being told. So there's a sort of important distinction to start to look at. And Barth, having seen some of what you wrote, I think it's just a matter of semantics at that point. It sounds like you're definitely doing that kind of work as well. I'm not questioning you there, but it is definitely a thing we like to sort of be very clear that we want to be looking at the sort of political economy aspect as well as simply the literate aspect.
Yeah, I'll add to that too. I take a pretty basic approach with my kids. It starts off with just being aware of what we call your media diet, right? The kids need to understand the variety of media that they consume, much as they might consume any kind of food. They're consuming media from especially nowadays, a variety of sources. And, we start off the year by having kids catalog for a little bit their media diet, the variety of times that and exposures that they've had to the media in their life that just kind of make them aware of just how pervasive it is. And from there, as Ben talked about, the whole critical media literacy point is understanding who produces the media and why. That's kind of the second point for media literacy. And then from there, it really gets down to, again, I think this is kind of a critical media literacy perspective, being skeptical, being analytical, asking questions, and also being able to produce your own fundamental media to understand the processes behind it, so that you can also kind of understand where those people that are sending messages to you, where they're coming from. So that's kind of a threefold approach that I take in terms of defining the media literacy and studying it throughout the year with my kids.
What's the biggest obstacle?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't
like.
Sorry.
What's the biggest obstacle that you find for your students when it comes to media literacy?
I mean, I think we have an illusion with that. There's this digital native concept that's still out there, and I think it's an illusion. I think we say, oh, kids know how to use media, kids know how to use technology. Well, no, I mean, like all of us, really, we pick up the skills and the ability to use the things that we want to use, the things that we're drawn to. So I know students who know how to manipulate all the video game apps they have, who know how to use their social media very, very, very even very creatively, but it doesn't mean that they understand the media, right? And that was the purpose of the book, was to start finding a way to share with young people what's behind, what's the inner working. We use a sort of metaphor of a clock. We can look at an old-fashioned analog clock and we can tell the time, right? But we don't necessarily know how the gears work to create the mechanism that we call a clock. So we're really trying to sort of help them see past the dial, past the face, and look at that. So when we look at screens, cool, we can see what's happening on the screen, but that's the questioning part. That's the skepticism part. Who's creating that message and why, as Barth so sort of idly put it. That's what we're looking for, is how do we do that? And we stress throughout the book that questioning is the way we want to do this. We're not telling you what to think. We're trying to help you engage about how to think. And that's a really, really important distinction. So we who practice critical media literacy have been pigeonholed by some others who take a different approach and have been, you're always telling students what to think. I haven't met a single person who professes critical media literacy or engages in it with students who thunders and indoctrinates, as teachers are so often accused of doing. I haven't met a single person who does that, even though they may be strident about their own views. I haven't seen it.
Well, that seems to be a thing that especially right-wing politicians push, this idea that, all of our teachers are liberal and they're all teaching these kids to think woke thoughts. And, that's just not, at least my experience. I mean, I've put now 4 kids through school. I've got a lot of friends that are teachers. I know they're not some of them aren't particularly motivated politically at all. So how unjust is that? This idea that, and Barth and I have talked about the idea that there are people who still seem to suggest CRTs being taught to the children in school.
Nowhere. I mean, I haven't seen. Okay, so I say nowhere. Well, maybe I'm wrong, but I haven't seen it in any curriculum anywhere where there's actual CRT being taught. Are there people who embrace those concepts and want to kind of share? I mean, I call it warts and all history, right? That's what I want. I want students to look at critically. There's that critical word again, right? Let's look critically at history. Let's look critically at our own nation, our own state, our own local governments, all of those levels, at our own personal family histories, whatever it is. But it's not to make anyone feel bad. It's to say, how can we exist in the world if we don't take a critical lens on our reality, our history, our screen use, our literature, our art, all of it. That's what we have to do. And no, I haven't seen that. Even the most sort of activist teachers I have known or whom I engage with on social media, I've talked to them about their lessons. I've seen what they do, and I don't see this indoctrination like you must believe what I believe. I haven't seen it.
I'll add to that. I think Joe and I last week, we talked about how I responded to a reader from one of my recent op-eds where I thought that I espoused mandatory media literacy K through 12, like New Jersey's law that just passed. And I got a response from a reader who's went, with the typical, I don't agree with that because most teachers are liberal, the ergo they're going to push their agenda. And I responded to him. My response was referring to an op-ed I had written a number of years ago, where I said, if I indoctrinate kids in any ideology, it's the ideology of critical thinking. And that's the indoctrination. I want the kids to use their brains, and I want the kids to, research and learn the research techniques to find the facts that help them to think critically. It's today, for instance, or actually it was yesterday in my, I also teach AP language and composition. And I had the students look at the new so-called "Don't Say Gay" law, which I didn't even use that term. I use the official term, which has to do with parental rights, which is another loaded term, but that's for another time. But the kids came up, oh, that's the "Don't Say Gay" law, right? It's like, well, yeah, but let's take a look at it. And I want you to, like, they had to form an opinion or a position, and then find evidence and to back that position. And at the conclusion of the lesson, I asked them, I said, I don't know if I could have taught this lesson in Florida under this particular law because it's kind of vague. But the point is that I said, do you sense that I feel one way or the other about this issue of discussing transgender issues and sexual orientation? The kids are like, no, it's like, we just had a discussion about it. And that's the whole point. It's, as you said, if you can't understand the world, you can't understand the current events, you can't understand history unless you approach them directly with facts. And sometimes it's uncomfortable, but that's kind of what it means to be a human being. So exactly. The only indoctrination is to get the kids to think for themselves.
That's got to be hard enough on its own, let alone try to tell them what to think.
Well, if we all could indoctrinate, if we had the power to indoctrinate children, let's just say they'd read more books.
Yeah. Right?
I've said the same thing. I wish I had that power over my students, because I obviously, there's a lot of ways that I failed if I've tried to indoctrinate them, because there's a lot of them that they, quite frankly, don't work up to their level of ability. So if I could indoctrinate them in how to be a good student, I would do that. But I don't have that kind of power. It's like, I wish I could wave a magic wand, but it's kind of. And
funny. To be, I don't know, even-handed in this conversation. I don't know if we can be, but I think that if we look at this question of indoctrination, it's sort of a silly argument, because if we look at our own schooling when we were young, the three of us sitting in this digital space together, think about how we were taught U.S. history. What other angles were there? America's great. And yeah, okay, so we did a short thing on the Trail of Tears. Okay, yeah, that happened. Slavery was bad. Okay. But, to be honest, I didn't learn about the Tulsa Race Massacre until maybe 3 years ago, by my own reading and exploring and living in the world that we live in today. So, I don't think that indoctrination, one person's indoctrination is another person's education, I guess. And that's the thing that makes me interested in this argument, is that we can look at our own histories as young people when we went to school and go, hey, if we look at it honestly, like, we weren't given the kind of critical thinking openness that I think so many kids get today. Whether they like it or not, whether parents like it or not, that's another question. But I walk into any classroom and I see at least more open conversations than I feel.
Yeah. That's a good point, Ben. My wife is a Spanish teacher. She happens to teach at the same school where I teach. She happens to be 2 doors down from me. I never see her. Well, I don't say never, but we hardly see each other during the day. But we often talk about our kids and our lessons. And just today, we had the kind of conversation that, the things that she does in her Spanish class, the things that I do in my various English classes, I wish I had a teacher that did them when I was in high school, because it's really pretty cool. And I'm doing things that I think are really opening kids' minds. And To Ben's point, it's, a lot of this we didn't even get. I mean, my personal example is I didn't even know there was such a thing as a Japanese internment camp during World War II until I went to college. That's criminal. I mean, I'm sorry, that's educational malpractice, right? If there are, I mean, okay, so that maybe that makes white people feel guilty or feel uncomfortable, but okay, go with the feeling, because that actually happened. I'm not here to blame anybody. I'm here to just present facts as a teacher. And so I think today. Go ahead, Ben.
Well, you bring up emotion and feelings, and I think that's, I had occasion last year to think about kind of somebody said to me, if you had five, I won't do the whole five, but if you had five, sort of practices or approaches that you would use in your, and it was about media literacy, but in general, in education as a teacher, what would they be? And my first one was honor emotion. We are human beings. We walk into the classroom with feelings, with experiences, whether those are wonderful experiences, whether those are trauma. We walk in with beliefs that have been inculcated in us in other ways through, everything we do and experience affects who we are as human beings, right? Our personality is built on a series of experiences throughout our lives, some of which you can point to individually, some of which are much more kind of ongoing, intangible kind of things. But my first principle is honor emotion, right? And allow students to feel it and then use that to go somewhere. I literalized this with teaching English a few years ago. And I said, I actually started after reading a story or a chapter or whatever the assignment was, I actually literally started saying, so did you like it? And then because then you can say, no, okay, why? Well, reading's boring. Okay, fine. But this story, okay. And then they say, well, and you get into like their reactions. And then you could go, okay, that's your reaction. Let's start to analyze that, break it down, do the access, analyze, evaluate, right? And get to response, right? From reaction to response, because response is more measured and more analytical and more intellectual. But you start with, right, that gut reaction almost. And I think that's what we do with media most of the time. When Barth, you guys were talking last time about news literacy specifically, and the idea, I don't remember if this exactly came up, but I think about that, and we talk about it in the book a little bit, about sharing, right? When we share a story that we found. That's what it was, Barth. You talked about outrage. If you're feeling outrage, there's probably something wrong with the story. Something like that is what you guys were talking about. And I think that's really valid, right? And one of the sort of techniques that we end the book with, one of the suggestions for action, is slow down. Right? Slow down with your media consumption, slow down with your responsiveness to the media, or reaction rather to the media, and go, do I really want to share this? And go, let me go look at other sources and see if it's really what I think it is, right? And we do this with memes, we can do this with news stories, whatever it is, right? Go and look and think and slow down. And I deliberately do that because I was getting a little passionate there. But we have to do that.
I have a friend who often shares articles from the Babylonian Bee. I don't know if you guys are aware of that site. It's a satirical site. Only I don't think he knows
the right-wing onion.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I don't think this guy understands that most of the stuff that he's posting, right? I don't think he gets the satire or the irony in some of the articles and what he's posting. And I'll comment, and I only think he knows because every now and again he's like, it's all satire. And I'm like, well, why do you even post that? Like you're doing that to get a negative reaction from people, right? Like, again, I think when you're invoking emotion from a news story, like if it's not a sad story about, a village being burned down with children in it, if you're reading a news story and your blood is literally boiling, I think that was very much intended. And I think that's important, especially for adults who can act on things, unlike children. It's important for them to understand when they're reading things like that, that they're reacting exactly the way the author intended them to.
Well, exactly. So that's the whole nature of satire. And the News Literacy Project would lists satire as one of the 5 major categories of can be one of the 5 categories of misinformation. Satire. Satire. 1984 was satire by George Orwell, right? And what I try to tell kids is satire. Oftentimes it's funny. They're mocking, but often, especially online, especially in Babylon Bee, there is a point behind the satire, and this is where the whole critical media literacy point comes in. It's like, okay, that's funny, and I know they're making fun of something, and that's great. Let's go a level deeper and find out, why are they doing this? Is there a message below the surface that, even if you can't explain it, you can't put it into your own words, you get that gut feeling again, and which is why you agree with it. And that's tough to do with kids, tough to do with adults too. But satire, that's kind of what they do. I mean, I use the example of Saturday Night Live. Saturday Night Live is, I grew up with Saturday Night Live and I found it funny, but any of the skits they do, especially regarding current events, they're funny, but there's also a point to them. They're making fun for a reason. So satire, it's tricky. So Joe, as you say, it's okay, fine. I'm just sharing it because it's funny. Well, yeah, but let's step back and figure out, why is it funny and why did they write it to begin with? So I think that's what, and Ben, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's what is meant by the critical media literacy, is to, really start asking questions about it.
So it's definitely like we start with that in the book, that critical media literacy is about asking questions, and that's the goal, right? Skepticism, as I like to say, skepticism opens a conversation, cynicism ends a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to inculcate, foster, share. Indoctrinate. No, but we want to foster in our students, in our young people. I mean, I'm a parent as well, and I know, Barth, you are too. And Joe, you said you had 4 kids. So as parents, we want to do this too, right? We want to foster critical thinking. We want to foster questioning. And what do little kids do, right? The younger the child, the more full of questions they are. And we kind of societally, arguably educationally, we kind of train the questioning out of them. There's a whole argument to be made about killing curiosity through school. Maybe that's another show. But it's true, right? That there's an aspect of that, at least. I brought this up with some colleagues the other day, and I think I was going to get pilloried, so I stopped. But that's a thing, right? Like, we want them to question, and I want teenagers and tweenagers, if you will, right? I want everybody to question. I want the adults to question. And I've had these discussions. And speaking of like challenging people's thoughts online, like I'm on Facebook and I start deconstructing a meme that somebody posts. And they're like, "Oh, Ben, you're taking it too seriously." I'm like, "No, I'm taking it seriously. I don't know about too serious." And people say, "Oh, you're reading too much into it." No, I'm reading it. There's something different there, and that's what we want to foster, right? And that's what we do in the book, is that we're trying to put up examples to get the young people to think about what's past that. And what's really important is that our intent in the book is to talk up to young people, right? To treat them as the agents that they are, agents of their own lives, and honor where they come from and what they do. For instance, we don't want to kill people's enjoyment of media. I love television, right? I watch, it's like we're in this sort of golden age of streaming television, right? I love TV, I love movies, all of that. I love social media for that matter, right? We don't want to like destroy that enjoyment. We want to help create and foster a sort of critical distance, because if we have that critical distance, we can actually ultimately enjoy more what we're engaging in, and we can see those messages and we can kind of do something with them, right? Isn't it better to know what you're getting into and to have a sense of like, oh, there's something deeper here? Well, and that deeper might be a grand and wonderful thing, not necessarily a dark and horrible thing, right? Isn't it great to know that and to feel that deeper connection, that deeper understanding of what you're looking at? And then, you can still just laugh or still feel the feeling. And then afterwards be like, oh, wait, why did I feel that? What happened then?
Right.
And not all the time, but that's what we want to sort of create, those habits of mind, if we want to use the educational jargon, to get people there, right? To think that kind of thing. I think that's important.
Yeah, that actually goes back to my first point. When I define media literacy to kids is, they figure out their media diet. That's first, number one, recognize it. Number two is then manage it. gain some level of control over it, and you're not going to be able to manage it or control it unless you understand it, as you say. And I don't tell kids I'm not going to tell kids to get off social media or tell kids what they should and shouldn't watch. I'm going to tell them, maybe you should think about why you're watching it, and then maybe you can, manage it so that it's, you feel like you're in control of it rather than it's in control of you. Social media is a perfect example. I mean, that when we go into our unit on social media, and I talk, you start, and this is where kids, I think, they're starting to get a little bit more conversant in this, but I tell them that, do you realize that social media is basically controlling you more than you're controlling it? There's all of the big data behind the scenes that they're collecting on you, and that if you can control your exposure to social media, then you're taking away a little bit of the control behind the scenes. So it really is. You want the kids to think about what they're consuming in their media so that they can get some measure of control. And by all means, I've taught film in the past, and film is its own language. And kids, I love it when kids come back and say, well, number one, they'll say, you ruined film for me because I go and I watch this film and all I do is start analyzing it. But because I'm thinking about, the point of view and the shot and the lighting and the music. And I said, well, that's great. I mean, then you're getting it, man. You're understanding what the director and, the various people behind the creative process, what they're doing. And that, I think that just enriches the process or enriches the experience for kids when they're exposing themselves to media.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's two things I want to throw out that came through what you were talking about. The first one is how we're being used by the social media. And so we have a section in the book about multiple literacies. And one of the literacies we talk about is algorithmic literacy. Mm-hmm. So starting to help students understand what the algorithm is doing on any given site, whether it's, from Google to, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, like all of that. So that's a really important concept for all of us to know more about. And this is an area of the book where I was like, I didn't know that, right? So I'm learning from my colleagues, from my co-authors, and that's really, really wonderful. The other part is, this idea of social media, like we are not the user, we're the product, mm-hmm. Right? We are the product. We are, we talk about that in the book, that we're creating this material, this content, and if we all just stopped posting on social media, there would be no social media. It would be gone, right? Which is really interesting. And we spend a lot of time also talking about the attention economy, right? That our society now is built, and our economy in many ways is built on stealing our attention, stealing our mind, right? What impact does that have on our own cognition, on our own place in the world, on our own sense of self? Years ago, when I was teaching media literacy, I had a poster that had like all these sort of statistics and facts about media literacy. And one of them was within 3 minutes of looking at, and it was cited on the poster, blah, blah. But within 3 minutes of looking at fashion magazines, women reported feeling depressed. Well, now we don't need fashion magazines for that. Yeah. Now we have the internet, yep. Right? And we have TikTok, and we have Snapchat, and we have, but if you look at this question of influencers, right? What are they often influencing is negative for people. Like we can't keep up with, right? We talk about keeping up with the Joneses, the old concept, right, of that. And now it's like we're trying to keep up with the Kardashians. We're trying to keep up with, the influencer du jour, right? And why? That there's that whole mental health aspect that's part of this. That media diet, well, that's a piece of it. And when you look at the statistics and you can say, wow, teenagers are spending 11 hours a day on screens. And a lot of that is on digital multitasking, right? They might have more than one screen. And by the way, just the other day, I found myself doing that. I had my phone with Twitter on it. I had the computer open. I was looking at Facebook and doing email. And my wife walked through. She's like, wait, you're double fisting it? Like, what's going on over there? I'm like, oh, yeah, I don't know. And it's just like, make my brain freak out. So we want, young people to think about that. And of course, what I like to think too is that, through the process of talking up to young people, what we've tried to do is make the book really accessible. And I think we did a pretty good job. We actually have I think think they're both undergraduates, right? I might be wrong about that, but we had two actual young people. Like a lot of us were the middle-aged, folks, like me. But we had a couple of young people actually on the book, and it was great to have them there going, yeah, that example doesn't, you don't know what you're talking about. Or, well, yeah, TikTok doesn't really work that way. Okay, cool. So straighten us out, right? So we got to learn from the youth that we got to work with, which is the beauty of, that's what we all of us, all of the middle-aged people who were on that team, we work with young people every day in some fashion or another, and we learn from them all the time in person. So it was really wonderful to bring in to the creative process, into the writing, into the critical media literacy work, these younger folks. And subsequently last year, I got to go to a conference late last year out in California. And I actually met some of these folks for the first time in person, which was really wonderful. We wrote this whole book, by the way, sort of during COVID. So we were never all in the same room at the same time until last fall in October. It's just amazing. But it was really great to have that. And on top of that, at that conference, there were young graduate students presenting material, presenting their research. So that's the future, right? Is like, how do we bring young people, not only fostering this critical media literacy idea, but how we bring young people into actually sort of following their interests to take action in the world on what matters to them, even while they're still in high school.
Thank goodness, I guess, that kids today do understand the algorithms way more than adults do. Now, I talk about my mom a lot because my mom spends a lot of time on social media, like a teenager. Only my mom has no media literacy at all. And to the point where, Ben, if you were to post something on your page, my mother takes it personally. She'd be like, what does Ben mean by that? And I'm like, that's not meant for you. He's just sharing his own thoughts. Well, I hate it. And I'm like, well, you don't have to read it. I think there's a lot of older people who, when they see things in their feed, they still are under the impression that people are sort of gearing things to send them a message. And I know, isn't that a bizarre thing? But I think there's a big element of that. I know quite a few people who seem to be of that mindset.
I would. I think there's another element to that too, and it doesn't just pertain to the older generation, and that is with Twitter in particular, because you are in one aspect in direct connection to a lot of famous people like Joe Biden. I can talk to Joe Biden. And so I think people feel that because Twitter is so open, or it seems so open, that they can have these conversations and they feel like they're part of it. And I think it gives them a delusions of grandeur, for lack of a better term, where they believe that okay, you're posting this stuff at me and I can post back at you, but I can interact with these people, and you know what, since I have access on Twitter, it matters. What I say matters. And I wrote a piece that just might come out shortly about Tom Nichols wrote The Death of Expertise in 2017, which was all about how we have become a society, a Google fueled society, where people think all of a sudden that they're experts of Chinese balloons that fly across the country, and
your own research.
I think this is what should happen. It's like, you do. Okay, so you've been sitting in on those meetings with the CIA and with the Pentagon and with Joe Biden, right? Okay, fine. It gives these people this idea, because they have this platform where they know that there could be some people high up that are going to read it, that, okay, what I say really matters. And I think that disproportionate situation also kind of creates the confusion and a lot of the problems surrounding, the polarization, to be for one, but just a lot of the issues that surrounding the media literacy are related to that. At least that's what I'm finding.
I always I paint critical media literacy as a full interdisciplinary experience. A few years ago, when I was doing this with high school students, I actually decided that we needed to start figuring out how to read studies. right? How to take, studies show. Okay, great. What does that mean, studies show? So there had been this, and it was fairly old even then, but there had been a study done on the concept of secondhand television. I thought was really interesting. And they chose that language deliberately, like secondhand smoking, right? To look at, and it was this idea that when the young kids, the toddlers, whatever, are playing on the floor and mom and dad are watching mom and dad TV, well, the kids are still taking it in, right? What does that look like? What does that do for or to those young people? Really interesting. But I started looking at it, and I brought it to them first as it was like a CNN, report or something about the study. And they said, well, somebody, because they do, right? Somebody in the room said, well, what was that study? What? And I said, oh, well, let's go find it. So I emailed my friend who had the pediatrics magazine subscription and said, hey, can you send me a PDF? And he said, and so we took the time to say, all right, how do we read this? Because it was all this methodology. And, you've read those. I'm sure, Barth, you've probably done something like this. But, you look at that, and it's like, here's the methodology. Here are the conclusions. And you look at the methodology and you're like, N equals P equals, and it's all this kind of like graduate student PhD language, right? And so I had to learn how to read it. And then I did some things with them to kind of like break it down. And of course, the critical angle was like right on the first page, it talks about who the sponsors of the study were. Right. So then you can take that and you can look at like tobacco studies, and you can look at, right. But I wanted to get that idea of like, okay, if you're going to do critical thinking, how, right? How do you know? You can't just accept studies show, because who made the study? How did they create the study? It's like surveys and polls. If you talk about politics, right? Who's creating that? What are their questions as researchers? We all know that some researchers are going to, I think it's a small number, but there are some people who are going to go, I have a conclusion. I'm going to go do some work to get me to that conclusion, prove that conclusion. We don't want that, right? And I don't think this study did that, by the way, to be clear, from when we read it. But it was really fascinating to go through it with them and have them go, I don't understand this at all. Okay, I don't either, right? Let's figure it out together how these things are written so that we can, in the future, give you those tools to approach on your own the critical thinking.
It's interesting how all these issues are related. I mean, it just makes sense. But reading studies reminds me of all of the COVID vaccine misinformation, especially on Twitter, that I'm finding now. And you got a lot of people that they'll post that study, and then so then, oh, look at that study. That study proves this, and there's a lot of people that have that emotional reaction to it, and they've been fed all of the same information because of their algorithm, and so they just instinctively just share it. They don't slow down. They don't take the time to see what is this study? Where did it originate? Who funded it? Like all of these things you're talking about. It's just this snap reaction that, oh, you know what, man, I agree with that. Sharing it right there. And it gets to the point where, I talk about balancing your algorithm on social media. I try to follow a variety of people, and it got to the point I was following some people that are big into the vaccine. The COVID vaccine causes more problems than it solves. It actually kills people, and you have all the sudden deaths and all that stuff. You follow these people, and it got to the point where I just got down this wormhole. I was like, enough. I mean, I get it. I get the point now, and I just needed to step away. But these people they're done, and it all has to do with what you talk about. They have the emotional reaction. They share it. They don't bother to stop. And I talk a lot too about nuance and context. I do lessons in my unit right now that we're doing. I call Finding Truth in a Digital World, where they need to just stop and rather than just instinctively share things, and look at what's the context of this study, and what are some of the nuances, what are some of the finer details that can really tell us the story.
I've always been skeptical of the do your own research people, because most of them don't know how to research. They don't know what to research. They don't understand their own personal or the information biases, right? Oftentimes you're trying to prove a point and you Google and you skip all the articles that don't seem to be saying what you want them to say in favor of the one that, this is perfect. It's 10th on the list here. but it says exactly what I want it to say. How hard is it to get young people to recognize their own personal biases when they're doing research? Because again, I would think with adults who are already pretty set in their thoughts, it's got to be a lot harder for them to kind of wade through all this.
I mean, I think it's a really mixed bag. I mean, I think, and that's what I find. I find it hard to generalize around young people or old people like me. I think we have to be really careful, right? Because I have met students who are more critical than I am, more skeptical, and I have met students who will just swallow whatever if it meets whatever beliefs they have at that moment. And I would say those same exact descriptions could hold true for adults I've known. I mean, to be perfectly honest, like I fancy myself a critically media literate citizen, right? That's the phrase we use in the book. But I fancy myself critically media literate, and yet there I was some months ago. Barth, you brought up the "Don't Say Gay" law, so-called, and there I was, and I'm seeing these little, like emotionally laden comments on Facebook and Twitter, and I'm getting all wow, and I found myself like just ranting against it, and I stopped. And I was like, I was writing a Facebook post, and I'm like, I said, wait, I'll be back, right? And I posted something like that, and I went, and the next day, I didn't do it right away. The next day, I went and I found the text of the law, which I think had not yet passed at that point. It was a legislation, it was a bill. So I found the text of the bill because one can do that by going to the state government legislature website and going through the layers. We can teach students how to do that. We can teach adults how to do that. We can teach ourselves how to do that. It's like the media bias fact check you were talking about in the last episode, Barth. Like there are tools, and this one is every state has their legislation on the web. Might be hard to find, but you can find it. So I went to the site, I read the actual legislation, and I thought about it, and I spent some time, and I took some notes, and I posted on Facebook. Got me nowhere, but it was good for me. A breakdown, right, of my analysis of the "Don't Say Gay" law, and they were right. Like some of it was not necessarily terrible, I say, kind of with a, but what does age appropriate mean, right? We will not touch on topics until it's age appropriate. Okay, what does that mean? Who's making that decision? And what does that mean? And the biggest problem I don't say the biggest problem, but one of the problems that I zeroed in on was not what the law said, but what the law allowed, right? Of the chilling effect, if we want to use a journalistic term, right? That like, yeah, it's only K-3 that we won't do that. Well, yeah, but if you know that law's there and you're an 8th grade teacher, aren't you going to be going, I don't know if I can say anything because I don't want to go to jail. I don't want to get fired, right? And that's the interesting thing is because we talk about like the emotion part. Well, these laws and this rhetoric creates fear. I just saw this thing today. Like Kevin McCarthy said that Sarah Huckabee Sanders gave a great speech and showed the Republicans don't believe in fear mongering. I'm just going to leave that one hanging there.
Wow. Yeah.
I said,
saw that too.
But back to "Don't Say Gay." But like I thought about the chilling effect for a long time, and I posted that on there. And now they've combined it with the woke act or whatever it's called. And now, guess what? Only a few months later, we see the books being covered in paper or removed from the shelves, and teachers being told your classroom library is now not open to anyone. Who's going to decide that? We're going to have a committee of interested persons to decide whether your books pass muster under this law. That's crazy, right? Mm-hmm. And dangerous. And it takes us to look at this idea again. So like go from critical media literacy to just critical living, right? And look at these questions and go, is that a society we want? Right. And of course, to go back, like I got it from the media experience, right? But I slowed myself down, rule 1. I thought more critically, rule 2, right? And I took the time to kind of take that deep dive. If we all did that, or let's just say if maybe half of us did that, it would start to change the discourse.
That's a great point, Ben. I think that I learned more about media literacy by the practices that I undertake in social media and my reading practices, and I do the exact same thing. It's like I try to make it a point of like if I'm making a critical point and responding to a post, provide at least one resource that if people want to follow up on, they can use it. And I don't want it to be, I'm not going to use Gateway Pundit, or I'm not going to use, I don't even want to use this, CNN or MSNBC. I want to try to get a what media bias fact check would say is a factual, reported, politically, basically, left of center, right of center. But I want to provide that source along with my post, because I've checked it out and I was like, you know what? How about you look at it from this angle? And as a teacher, I think this is a common frustration of most teachers. After a while, you get into that groove, and that's what you end up doing. And it gets frustrating when, it's kind of like the kids. It's like, come on, man, you should be able to do this too. So the practice of doing it myself, it's something that you want to try to bring to the kids in the classroom. And you're right, Ben. They are all over the map. I mean, my media literacy class, I have 2 sections. Is what's called heterogeneously grouped, which means that it's not an honors class. It takes everybody. And so I've got soup to nuts in that class in terms of variety of abilities. It's mostly seniors. A few juniors are in there, but it's, assorted from every angle. So it really is. There's going to be some kids that are going to be able to take these strategies and use them. And then there's some kids that are, it's going to be a little bit more difficult for them. Or, there's also the kids that have been influenced by their families in certain ways that, it's kind of hard to break through that too. Getting back to the original discussion about, making the difference between, I'm not indoctrinating you in any ideology or whatever, but, and the kids might, they just echo their parents and say, well, wait a minute, maybe you are. So, it's a challenge. It's a challenge.
What do you do with a student? What do you do with a
Sorry,
student whose parents have really guided them politically one way or the other, where they're just spewing talking points and can't really see the reality, whether that be right or left wing? I think that's certainly, how do you, let's say, deprogram somebody, but how do you work around that?
Well, I think it's the questioning again, right? We go to this idea of like starting to question the student, like, why do you believe that?
Mm-hmm.
Where did you think of this? And so, I think of 2 things. Like, I think it was last year, I had a student and I was working as an English teacher. I'm doing a different function now in the school, but I was doing English teacher work and we were doing argument writing, and the student was writing about gun control. And he was clearly, I teach in Vermont, I live in New Hampshire, I teach in Vermont. They're very close, and he was a gun culture guy, right? Like, Vermont is filled with people, not filled, but a lot of Vermonters are hunters, fishers, right? People who live in the outdoors and engage in those kind of activities. Cool, like that's fine. I have no problem with hunters, right? And so we had this discussion, and they were allowed to choose their own topics. And he started talking about gun control. And one part of the essay, he said, well, and this law was written by an uninformed liberal who had no idea what he was talking about. And I said, well, all right. I said, so what do you know about the legislative process? Did that person write that law? Did it change at all from the original law that was written? Were other people involved in the writing of that law with the person who initially created it? I'm not going to tell you it worked. I'm going to tell you it didn't work, actually. But that was with that kid. But with other students, had I taken that approach, there's a sort of a gradual effect, right? I think we can talk about this. So Bill McKibben in The Age of Missing Information talks about the cumulative effect of TV viewing. I think we can talk about the cumulative effect of questioning, right? Mm-hmm. Of continuing to ask those questions to get a young person, any person, but we're talking about students, to get a young person to think a little more deeply, a little differently, in a more nuanced or detailed fashion. If you're going to talk about writing laws, you better understand the legislative process, right? And one person does not write a law and go, here, Congress, and they pass it just as it is, right? That doesn't happen.
And nobody reads it, of course, either.
Well, there's that. Where's the critical thinking in Congress? But
right.
But so that's my take. The other thing I think about is I was was teaching at a school in New Hampshire 4 years ago now, maybe it was 5 years ago, 4 years ago. And I was teaching AP Lang, and I had juniors and seniors, and very interesting group of kids. And this was in a town that was pretty mixed in the kinds of, so we say, the ideologies of the families. I had this one kid who I adored this young man. He was wonderful. He was such a giving, kind, like supportive. He created I forget what they called it, but it was a club where it was kind of like a Big Brothers Big Sisters, but it was, instead of older and younger people, it was peers working with developmentally delayed young people. This kid had the biggest heart. He was a Trump supporter. It was fascinating. And we had this conversation one day. He came to the room and he was all upset because he was wearing his MAGA hat and people were yelling at him. Like, other students were giving him a hard time. Teachers were giving him a hard time. And I said to him, I'm stopping myself from using his name. I said, do you think that people have a reaction to the hat because it's the hat, not because it's you? And he kind of looked at me. I said, do you think people are surprised that you would wear that hat? And we ended up having a longer conversation. We walked out together and walked out of the lunchroom, and he then went and hung out with his buddies. But we had this long, ongoing conversation for a little while. And then maybe a month later, maybe 2 weeks later, I don't know. He said to me, he said, Boyington, he's like, you're such a liberal. And I'm like, if you must use the label, okay. And I said, yeah, is that okay? And he looked at me and he said, but you accept me for who I am. You're not giving me crap, and he might not have said crap, for what I believe. And I said, right, but do I ask you questions about what you believe? And he said, yeah, and that's cool. So I think that's how you do it. I think you treat them with respect. And this, we're talking about teaching, but this is humanity too. And it's hard sometimes, right? I think you treat them with respect and you ask questions, and questions you honestly want the answer to. Not gotcha questions, not I'm the teacher, I'm going to teach you by using Socratic blah, blah, blah. But actually a question that you think will make them think, yes, but will also lead them somewhere, and that you want to hear I wanted to know what this kid thought about stuff, because he fascinated me. He was just such a cool, big-hearted guy and had this other political stance that I was like, what? So I honestly wanted to know.
I think what you're talking about, Ben, is what you had referred to earlier when you said emotion. The kids bring certain emotions to the classroom, and those are valid, and you need to accept those. And those emotions also include their beliefs. And I think that when you're dealing with kids, and it does, as you said, it's teaching. I think you last as a teacher if you basically accept kids for who they are and what they bring to the classroom, and don't, like you said, I don't push an ideology on a kid. And I think you're right. The kid will actually be much more receptive to me if I am curious about, where he's coming from. If it doesn't necessarily agree with, I might not agree with his ideology, but I want to know, and I will give him a chance to speak. And it's really just those kids need to feel validated, really, is what it's all about. And that's having that feeling. You have to establish that rapport, that tone in your classroom. And then from there, kids can feel comfortable. And, you have to set ground rules about if you get into debates and you have class-wide discussions about these kind of things. And kids are pretty good about that, at least what my experience. So, but because you are showing them that, okay, we're about discussion, we're about debate, we're about questioning, we're not about, pointing fingers at each other. And that's really where it all starts. If you really want to try to get kids to buy in, and absolutely with some kids, it's a long-term process that they might not ever get. They might get when they're out of the classroom 20 years from now. Some of them get it right away, but it really just starts with that attitude of, let's all respect each other's beliefs, because, we're all valid human beings with emotions and beliefs, and, let's go from there.
I'll tell you, and I got to surface my own biases in those conversations, right? I get challenged. And I get
Absolutely.
because they'll come back with questions. Like my first principle, if you will, was honor emotion. My second one is listen. So that's just what you're saying, Barth, right? Like we have to.
Yeah.
So not only do we have to listen and ask questions ourselves and honor emotion, but we have to foster those behaviors in the young people that we're working with.
Right.
Then
And then
we have to take them into our lives, because that's
yeah.
right. If we don't live it, who are we?
Right. And when you do that, then they trust you and they realize you're being honest with them. And quite frankly, they don't get that everywhere in school. They don't get that everywhere with adults. So that really, that rapport, that tone, I think is really what sets it apart, is what gets, if you're going to have any success at all with teaching them concepts like this, that's where it begins.
So I've spent the last year at Barth, I've had you on the show Ben, I do work for a right-wing radio station, espousing my left-wing views. And as you could imagine, whenever I pop on for the first couple of days, there is a lot of drawback. There's a lot of, they don't want to hear anything I'm saying. And I always point out to the audience, I'm like, listen, this is all tightly researched. I can't come into enemy territory and just start throwing things out there that are provably false. So if I'm telling you something, you could bank on it. At the end of last year, I was talking about the fentanyl coming into this country, right? There's this misnomer that people bringing in fentanyl are the illegal immigrants. And I went to the Cato Institute, a conservative think tank who had conducted a study on it. And so it was great to have that information. The Cato Institute showed 93% of the fentanyl was being brought in by American citizens. And to be able to cite a conservative think tank to a conservative audience about things they didn't want to hear, it worked. And to be able to always cite, especially if I can cite any sort of a right-wing outlet, it goes a long way towards getting that audience to like, oh, I don't agree with everything you're saying, but all right, you got the facts there. Where Barth mentioned this the other night, the post-truth world that we live in, where it doesn't matter what the numbers are, right? It's how are you feeling about things? Even though facts don't care about your feelings by those same people. It's interesting when you put them in that situation where you're giving factual information to sort of see how people want to try to wiggle around stuff,
I think basically what this goes right back to, we're talking about if you're indoctrinating and I mean, when like you as a radio host, we as teachers, if we show an open mind, right? If we show that we're not, okay, I want to listen to what you have to say, but I'm going to read some of the information from what that you consider valid. I'm going to read that too. And so so we can have that discussion. And I think from what I understand, one of the whole purposes of CT Politics TV is to have discussions among a variety of political orientations. That's something that we've pretty much lost that in this country for any number of reasons, which is obvious. It's another show altogether. But if you show that you're open-minded, hopefully that kind of greases the wheels a little bit and shows that, okay, we can have this discussion and I'm not just going to close my ears because you're a conservative. And so again, at least we can show that we're trying to have this discussion honestly.
If we're willing to think and we're willing to listen, we're all going to get a lot farther, as a society. I had a discussion with a student recently whose politics are, from what little we've revealed so far to each other, not mine, let's say. And she, at the end, she said to me, she said, look, the problem is common ground, that we do not, like in this country, we're not able to talk to each other about the common ground. She said, she looked at me and she's like, you and I don't agree on a bunch of things, but we talk to each other, we listen to each other. I was like, yeah, that's what we should do. It was just this really cool conversation, and it went in a bunch of different directions, but she said it, I didn't say it. And I'm like, you get it, man. Like, she came with that. I didn't teach her that. She just came with that. and very different, political stance. But wonderful, wonderful young person who has a lot to offer and is going to go out there in the world and do amazing stuff that's going to make us all go, oh yeah, I remember that kid,
Yeah.
and that's what we want.
I think what the kid mindset, teenage mindset, in a lot of ways is filled with all kinds of fallacious thinking. One of which is like this either or idea that there's always a right and a wrong answer. And I think what social media in particular has done is that has caused that kind of fallacious thinking to percolate upwards to adults, where we all believe. Not, I know we don't all believe, but a lot of people on social media believe you have to identify with your tribe, right? You have to identify with your side of the argument, and that's how social media has basically been, through algorithms, has been constructed. And unfortunately, I think it fosters this idea among adults that's a pretty immature idea, quite honestly, that there is only going to be one answer. There's a right way and there's a wrong way. And it's like, I don't know about you, but I mean, I used to have that black and white thinking when I was a kid, but when I got to college, that really opened my eyes. Like learning that the Japanese internment camps actually were a thing for the first time in my life, I realized that life is pretty gray, man. you got to be able to, wade through that. And unfortunately, I think social media kind of takes that away.
I think you're right. I think that it exacerbates this kind of spectrum or binary thinking, like even politics, even the fact that we still talk about left wing and right wing is really interesting to me, because it really isn't a line, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you look at any of us, we hold a variety of positions that at any moment could probably be identified in various wings, right? And I think it was Woody Guthrie who said, left wing, right wing, chicken wing, I don't care, which is great stuff. But if we look at it really, that's why we have like the quadrant political, websites and these other ways of looking at that. And that's true of almost anything. I was talking to my daughter recently, and she said, gender's not a spectrum, gender's a cloud. My mind just went, but it was wonderful. And then when we talked about that for a while. It's a first year college student to talk with, but fascinating, right? And if we open our minds to all of that, and if we open our minds to the way the media works in positive and negative ways, I could do another whole 15 minutes on this question of social media and anti-social media and what all that is. But read the book. But we can talk about that a lot. But I think you're right. I think that there's an exacerbation of binary thinking, of looking for the soundbite answer, of looking for the singular answer. And none of those things really exist. Life is gray, as you put it. Life is gray. And we have to figure out how to deal with that. And one way we deal with that through our work is critical media literacy.
Well, gentlemen, I appreciate your time and your expertise on these matters. Barth, you've always been my go-to guy on this stuff. Ben, great to meet you and great to talk to you about all of this stuff. There's so much for all of us to learn here. I'm glad you guys are teaching the youngins of America. Keep that stuff up, because, boy, we need this media literacy now more than ever before. We're going to be talking to some other folks about this media literacy. I hope to have you guys both back to engage in some of these discussions. I think it was extremely helpful. Make sure you follow both of these guys on Twitter, Keck B33 to follow Barth. Ben Boyington, you could follow him at Benbo370. Gentlemen, really appreciate the time. I had a lot of fun, and I learned a lot of stuff from you guys, so much appreciated.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me on. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah. And I'm glad I got to meet Ben not in person, but get to
close enough.
Almost, right? We're a step closer.
Yeah,
having exchanged on Twitter for a couple years or a few years now. I don't even know.
Yep.
But yeah, it's great to be here. So thank you.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Awesome, guys. We'll talk to both of you very soon. That is going to do it for us this evening. I am Joe Aguirre. We appreciate you watching CT Politics TV. You can also follow us on social media if you dare to go there at CT Politics. And we're online at ctpolitics.tv. That's it for us. Have a great night.